Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Trans Stupid, where I take a look at the wonderful world of LGBTQIA++ news, because stupidity is intersectional. So the first story that I'm going to touch on this week involves Meghan Murphy. Now, for those of you who haven't heard of her, Murphy is a radical feminist journalist and blogger who famously got hoisted off Twitter last year for daring to dead name a particular period-loving tampon fetishist who I am known to just not name for the time being. But she is quite prolific in the gender-critical circles, in particular a huge critic of transgender ideology. Naturally, that is a sin. And when she organised a number of talks over the last week, they have all been targeted by trans activists. One of which happened on the 29th of October, so about a week ago. And as you can see, it was a lovely day out for the kids to fight against the TERFs. A crowd of 1,000, doesn't really look like 1,000, but whatevs, stood shoulder to shoulder outside the Toronto Public Library's Palmerston branch on Tuesday night, chanting, "Trans rights are human rights," and whose library? Our library, because apparently it's only the hardline activists who get a say in who has the library. To protest at a lecture there by Meghan Murphy. One of the organisers said, "This is our chance to take back TPL. It's so amazing to see so many people here," adding that they had lined up a series of readings by trans authors and poets in the street outside the library to make it a public space where we celebrate trans voices tonight. Authors and organisers then read lines of trans prose to the crowd, which chanted it back in celebratory, loud voices. "How does it feel to listen and then amplify a trans voice?" asked another of the organisers. I mean, I wouldn't really know what it's like to amplify a trans voice here. I can't see you guys getting the crowd to chant out anything I might say. Many of the demonstrators held signs that said, "No hate, no fear," and TPL. Transphobes, please leave. Another organiser said the TPL is hiding behind free speech and said it had broken its connection with the queer community by allowing discrimination and hate. Chief Librarian Vickery Bowles has said the library has an obligation to protect free speech, and a review of Murphy's statements turned up no hate speech convictions or other disqualifiers. So again, you've got the trans lobby being the enemy of free speech, using it as though it's some sort of dirty word, and that you need to be able to remove platforms from people because others might have their feelings hurt, completely unaware that this is probably how freedom of speech works. You don't just protect the views that you like, you also have to protect the views that you don't like. But this wasn't the only protest against Murphy over the last couple of days. In fact, another talk that Murphy ran had to be relocated after a security concern. The organiser of a panel discussion on gender and sexuality says the location of the event in Vancouver has been changed over possible security risks because of the views of a featured speaker who drew protests at a Toronto Public Library this week. Professor Mark Collard of Simon Fraser University said the senior director of campus security assessed a high safety concern for the event that was set to take place on Saturday. Collard, who teaches human evolutionary studies, said he's been planning the event that includes Meghan Murphy since the spring, and ticket holders will be emailed a few hours before Saturday's talk with details of the new location. The security risk was assessed as 11 out of 10 and suggested violence could be used by a group called the Coalition Against Trans Antagonism, which is not affiliated with the university but out on campus, which supports LGBTQ students, was not considered a threat. Coalition Against Trans Antagonism. That's an interesting name, isn't it? Well, their website says that they are conducted on the ancestral, traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, and that they work in solidarity with Indigenous people in the struggle for autonomy and self-determination. They fight against trans exclusionary and sex worker exclusionary radical feminism, challenging oppressive ideologies and practices within governmental bodies, non-profits, academia, unions, community organisations and individuals. They envisage a world where there is safety, support, acceptance, dignity, autonomy and self-determination for trans people, especially trans women. Alright, and sex workers. But they also list some of their enemies, which includes Feminist Current, Vancouver Women's Library, and Vancouver Rape Relief Crisis Centre. When you list a rape crisis centre as a example of an antagonistic force, are you okay? Like, do you think that is something which a normie is going to look at and think, yeah, like, yeah, down with the centres that help vulnerable women? Honestly, if you find a rape crisis centre as your opponent, you're probably doing something wrong. But the group itself is quite a strange one, especially with their name. In fact, at one of the protests, they even walked around with a makeshift guillotine for those dastardly TERFs and SWERFs, and were so proud of it, they've even used it to advertise one of their upcoming events. Their Twitter account also posts a lot about fighting Nazis, fighting cops, and then they wonder why we are so concerned when we see the far left shouting about punching Nazis when all of a sudden you include cops in with that as well. This is an incredibly deranged group that seems to be at the forefront of organising a lot of these protests. This is something which, when you really sit down and think about it, these are the main groups out there which push the trans rights agenda. They are the ones with the loudest voices for some reason. And so when people think of trans activism, it's this loony left that are the ones that are jumping out and grabbing people's attention. And when they are ultimately looking at shutting down feminists for daring to just have a difference in opinion, why should they be surprised if I'm going to side with the gender critical people? Like, even if they're supposed to be my arch enemies, I would much rather these women be able to talk without fear and intimidation than have these crybabies, these cry bullies, walking around with bloody guillotines as though that's any kind of reasonable look. They are clearly in the wrong here, and I find it weird that they got so many family people and they paint themselves as they are against hate. I don't see the gender critical crowd walking around with makeshift guillotines threatening to punch the tranners. If they did, we'd be having a very different conversation. But until I see the likes of Meghan Murphy outright calling for violence against people like me, I'm afraid that these trans activists are going to be much lower in the pecking order. They are scum. And really, if they want to be having real debates about trans rights, first of all, they need to point out exactly what rights we don't have, but also allow the other side to talk and don't try and intimidate them into silence. I swear their name, a Coalition Against Trans Antagonism, must be ironic. It must be ironic because they're going out there to antagonise their opponents. We've seen this in the UK. We see it in Canada. This is a growing trend. It's one which is scary, and I completely understand why more and more people are getting worried about the trans movement when this is the image that is being put forward. So moving on to my next story, involves Jessica Yaniv. Now, I did a video the other week saying that, Yaniv is no longer relevant, and that is true. However, that doesn't mean that things don't happen around Yaniv, bizarrely. And someone managed to upset the tranners just by mocking this. I know, right? But current year. And that was Ricky Gervais. Ricky Gervais gets huge backlash for divisive Jessica Yaniv Halloween tweet. Comedian Ricky Gervais is well known for his forthright tweets and edgy comedy, which divides opinions at times, but now the creator of Extras in The Office has faced a barrage of abuse on Twitter for his Halloween tweet. He wrote, "I was going to dress up as something weird and creepy for my Halloween party, but I'm bucking the trend this year and I'm going as brave female activist Jessica Yaniv. This also means I don't have to wax my big old hairy balls." Jessica is a controversial transgender woman who has also become a divisive figure online. Controversial is putting it lightly. Divisive outside of the hardcore trans activists. I wouldn't call Yaniv a divisive figure. But let's continue. The 32-year-old Canadian says she will never give up fighting for human rights and equality. Okay, that's interesting. So they are automatically saying that Yaniv is this divisive figure, But before they even run into what Yaniv has done, which they do kind of touch on at the end, they paint Yaniv as an innocent activist, as some sort of innocent figure who's being targeted by this cishet white male bully that is Ricky Gervais. No, like, the Manchester Evening News appear to be taking Yaniv at their word that they are a human rights activist. Anyone who has been following this train wreck knows that Yaniv is far from a human rights activist. You know, if they're going to push all of that, why don't they mention some of Yaniv's racism? Because that certainly doesn't turn up here. Apparently Gervais apologised. He didn't really. It was simply a tongue-in-cheek reference. But the Manchester Evening News didn't read it like that. They finished the piece off just by mentioning about the Yaniv waxing case, but they don't touch into any of the real controversies that involve Jessica Yaniv, in particular the serious predatory allegations, the doxing, the violence that has been caught on camera, the racism, the Yanivery, the general Yanivery that has been going on. So I find this interesting because of the way in which all of this is presented. And it wasn't only in Manchester Evening News that covered this. There was a couple of different outlets that said that Ricky Gervais was being really controversial. It's really interesting seeing the amount of websites, tabloids that are really there to protect Yaniv. Like, they don't seem to do any research into him at all. Like, you would think they know about the waxing case, but what about anything else that Yaniv has done? And what's more, they seem to paint Yaniv as a representative of trans people. When you make fun of Yaniv, you're being transphobic. And in fact, the Metro story actually does add some of the tweets which were tweeted at Gervais who are really offended. Someone saying, "I really, really wish you'd stop with the trans jokes. JY is an awful predator, true. Her demands were ridiculous. But as a group, trans people are already beaten down so much. Poking fun at them is just assholery." Well, what's interesting about this is that particular person seems to be associating making fun of Jessica Yaniv as making fun of all of us, even though they acknowledge that Yaniv is a scumbag. That's interesting. Like, you're taking it very personally when it's clearly the joke is aimed only at one individual, and that's Yaniv. Another one added, "I'm not upset because you made a joke. That's what you do. But good comedians know it's all about timing. Not just yours, but society's. And I gotta say, the timing's way off. It's not too soon to make Yaniv jokes. Like, I've been doing it for months. It's fun." And other ones included, "Come on Ricky, you've done funny stuff over the years, but this is just odious and bigoted. And learning Ricky Gervais is transphobic is so disappointing." Of course Ricky Gervais isn't transphobic, but a lot of this stuff is ludicrous, and Gervais, who is someone who makes fun of everything and everyone, is going to make fun of trans stuff. You can't ask to put a shield up, and especially if your shield is going to be Jessica Yaniv, that is ludicrous to anyone. Yaniv is a joke. You should all acknowledge that Yaniv is a joke. Let us make fun of him. Let us make fun of any of these people. No topic should be off limits for comedy. Doesn't matter if you don't like it, then don't laugh. Don't watch that show. Don't get involved in that. And when you make things more taboo, it becomes more funny in general anyway. You add that extra level of edge to it. But, as I mentioned, I don't think Ricky Gervais is transphobic, and look, if Ricky Gervais is transphobic for not liking Jessica Yaniv, then, well, I was about to say, well, I would be considered transphobic, but, you know, you sometimes just have to look in my comments and you'll see that I'm labelled that all the time. But the final story that I'm going to cover this week involves someone who I probably haven't talked about on this channel as much as I should, although they did feature in last year's Halloween special, and that is Aimee Challenor. So, for those of you who don't know who she is, Aimee Challenor is a former member of the UK's Green Party who was suspended after it was found out that she'd hired her dad as a campaign manager whilst her dad was under investigation for torturing and raping a child. Her dad was then found guilty, and as a result, Aimee basically left before she got pushed and ran off to the Lib Dems. and became a big beacon of solidarity and diversity there as well. But it turns out that Challinor seems to have quite a funny record with being quite close to, well, paedophiles. As the Coventry Observer wrote an article saying that transgender activist Aimee Challenor is no longer in Coventry Liberal Democrats post amid investigation into safeguarding complaints. According to the article, one party source said that Challinor had been suspended pending an outcome of the investigation by national officials of the Liberal Democrats, and Coventry's LGBTQIA++ youth group PRISM is also facing questions concerning her ongoing role, including as vice chair of its management committee. So why was it that Challinor got suspended this time? I mean, they didn't only just learn about her dad, did they? Well, it turns out that they have just learned about something else, something which happened a couple of months ago, and that involves Aimee's fiancé. So a couple of months ago, Nathaniel Nye, who is an American and is someone who has been dating Aimee Challenor, wrote a strange series of tweets talking about various sexual fantasies that he has and what he writes about. And one of these in particular gained a lot of attention. He said, "Back to fantasizing. Yes, I fantasize about things I don't want to do in real life. I fantasize about things that are some combination of impossible, unethical, or otherwise outside of my personal capacity to act upon outside of fantasy. I fantasize about jumping 20 feet high, and I don't think that means I can or that it would be safe to do so." Okay, so fantasizing about jumping high, that's not really anything dodgy about that. But, harmless so far. I fantasize about children having sex. Sometimes with adults, sometimes with other children, sometimes kidnapped and forced into bad situations, sometimes coerced through fantasy mind control. Okay, I haven't actually read that tweet for a long time. I felt incredibly disgusted having to do that just then. Yeah, that's really sick. Yeah. I don't really have anything edgy to say about that. That's actually really depressed me just reading it. He tries to defend this bizarrely by saying, "Then again, I don't fantasize about torturing people for my own enjoyment. I don't fantasize about real children. Even if I fantasize myself with a fictional child, I have never looked at an actual real child pornography. It's a fantasy, like a child who pretends to be a dragon while their friend is a dragon-slaying knight, or a robber while their friends pretend to be the police. It's make-believe and imaginary. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Children playing cops and robbers is very different to you fantasizing about children being kidnapped, forced into bad situations, having sex with adults. That's absolutely sick. Absolutely speechless that someone could think of just putting that in writing." It should be said, however, that Challinor apparently denies that he wrote that, telling the Coventry Observer that she believed his account had been hacked. Although in the statement in the article, Challinor said, "Those tweets that were purported to appear on my partner's accounts were not his thoughts or opinions. He deleted the tweets as soon as he could. Because they are under investigation, I cannot comment too much on him. In terms of my role within the Liberal Democrats, you are right, there has been a confidential investigation. It's been going on since July. It was due to conclude shortly, but they have had to apply an extension to that because of the forthcoming general election. Even if I found out tomorrow I was allowed back into the Lib Dems, I would not be campaigning for them. I've long been planning a holiday and will be going on holiday in a few weeks, which is incredibly convenient. I won't be in the country for an election. I have today been at Coventry Central Police regarding harassment and malicious communications," because she has to turn it on to her, doesn't she? Challinor always does this. Always the victim. One of the first things that she became known for was when she called up TfL and got them to change their announcements from ladies and gentlemen to something more gender neutral because of her bloody voice. Constant victimhood. Now, the fact that Challinor has said that this wasn't her partner is something we obviously have to take into consideration. Certainly didn't appear to be the case back at the time when this was tweeted out. I can't really see any reason as to why someone would do this. But then it's such a bizarre line of tweets that who knows. But Challinor seems to have a quite worrying track record of being fairly close to paedophiles. What are your thoughts on the stories I've covered this week? Is there anything in particular I've missed out? Please let me know in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe. You can also support me on Patreon, and you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you once again, and I'll see you all next time. And a special thanks to Alex Meadows, Casey Adolphson, Dan Norman, Fenella Cooney, James C. George, Kim Vandry, Latin Creature, Liz Udesu, Nova B, Ricardo Jose, Rose Hypnol, Stephen, The Poor of Rizzo, Traname Girl, Green Potato Chips, Laisha, James Dorans, James UK, Moy Felicita, Kim Vandry, Sarah, and the rest of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar.